Good afternoon, and good morning, and good evening to everyone joining us online. I'm Jan Beagle, Director General of the International Development Law Organization, and I'll be moderating this session on recommendations, commitments, and investments in advancing justice and the rule of law. We hope to draw on the great discussions this week and the insights from our eminent panel to identify some concrete ways to accelerate progress on the rule of law at a time that is under severe pressure globally. So what do we know? Allow me to offer 3 quick points. First and foremost, we know that the status quo is not working. Even before the pandemic, more than 1.5 billion people had a justice problem they could not resolve. COVID-19 is widening this justice gap into a chasm, with the need for legal services and protection increasing, just as the ability to access justice has come under pressure from public health restrictions. We are experiencing a major crisis of confidence in public institutions, with already frayed public trust under further strain from corruption, impunity, and lack of delivery. Flagrant violations of human rights and international law and weakened multilateralism mean that conflict and crises are proliferating, even as we are less able to respond to global challenges. And today is the 100th day after the invasion of Ukraine. Second, we know that the extraordinary crises that we face can also present an opportunity to renew and reimagine justice systems. We must seize this moment to transition to more people-centered justice systems based on evidence and a clear understanding of justice seekers' needs. Over the past days, we have heard many examples of innovative approaches. Community-based initiatives, including those involving customary and informal systems, can bring justice closer to the people while helping ensure greater respect for human rights. Better data and evidence in understanding justice needs, setting policy, and evaluating the effectiveness of interventions can help us use our limited resources more effectively. Digital innovations have tremendous potential to expand access and increase transparency, but we must remember the digital divide. Third and finally, we know that we can only succeed if we work together. From COVID to climate change, conflict to corruption, our most pressing challenges are too big for any of us to solve alone. We need governments to act, but we also need young people, civil society, international organizations, and the private sector to step up and do their part. And as we have seen around the forum, there is no shortage of energy, enthusiasm, and entrepreneurship to bridge the justice gap and turn inspiration into action. So the stakes have seldom been higher, and so I'm very pleased to introduce an exciting lineup of speakers this afternoon. Mr. Jim Walsh, joining us online, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs in the United States Department of State. Thanks for getting up so early to join us. Ms. Etienne Odiambo, Director of the Legal Empowerment Fund. Mr. Janos Bertok, Deputy Director, OECD Public Governance Directorate, also joining us online, and Ms. Lisa John, Secretary General of Civicus. And I'd like to ask Etienne and Lisa to join us on stage. And just before we start, a few housekeeping points. Towards the end of the panel discussion, we will take some questions from our in-person and online audience. For both our in-person and online audiences, please use the World Justice Forum app to submit your question through the chat function. And when submitting a question, please include your name and affiliated organization. And now, let's turn to our panel, and I'm going to start with Mr. Walsh. Mr. Walsh, The United States government has been promoting a set of commitments in the context of the Summit for Democracy and the follow-on year of action, with a particular focus on concrete steps to curb corruption. Why is the administration prioritizing this work, and what is the US government committing to do? What do you see as the most important steps to be taken by your government and others over the next year? Over to you.
Well, thank you, Jan, and nice to see you again, even if it is virtual. And thank you to the World Justice Project for the opportunity to join this really important conversation today. So you really set the stage very well, Jan, and it's a great question. And to understand why the United States has made fighting corruption a national security priority, we just need to look no further than the current moment. Earlier this year, as you mentioned, the world watched in horror as Moscow launched an unjustified war against Ukraine. It's not an exaggeration to say that these events have truly changed the world and highlighted the importance of democracy as a counterweight to such illegitimate actions. And as we now take steps with our allies and partners to strengthen our rules-based order in the face of Putin's aggression, our efforts to advance justice and fight corruption have taken on an even greater urgency. So throughout the globe, corruption destabilizes governments and it undermines democracy, including when it's weaponized and wielded by autocrats and kleptocrats who support them. It also enables criminality, particularly transnational crime, and it's critical to the future of democracy that we join together to combat corruption. So the United States government hosted the first Summit for Democracy, and we brought together hundreds of governments, civil societies, and private sector leaders, with governments, including our own, making over 700 commitments to counter corruption and authoritarianism and promote democratic renewal and human rights. And in the United States, we're now putting these words into action. Prior to the summit, the administration released the first ever US strategy on countering corruption. And this outlines the United States' comprehensive approach to working domestically and internationally with governmental and non-governmental partners to prevent, limit, and respond to corruption-related crimes. So let me just highlight a few initiatives that really fall into the strategy. First, for far too long, corrupt actors and their financial facilitators have taken advantage of vulnerabilities in the United States and international financial systems, and they launder their assets and obscure their proceeds of crime. In response, the strategy elevates U.S. efforts to curb illicit finance. And to complement these efforts, we're also working to hold corrupt actors accountable. As we announced at the Summit for Democracies, we have a Democracies Against Safe Havens initiative, or we call DASH. We love our acronyms. And so DASH promotes accountability by building partner governments' capacity to detect, track, and disrupt corruption. DASH also works to deny corrupt actors the ability to hide ill-gotten gains by encouraging like-minded partners to develop and actively implement anti-corruption sanctions and visa restriction regimes, and by building the capacity of civil society organizations to accurately and impactfully report on the corruption. So the department is also employing diplomacy and foreign assistance to advance U.S. goals. And we build the capacity of foreign criminal justice sector partners to prevent and prosecute corruption and money laundering. And we try to trace and recover those proceeds of corruption. And we look to enhance the capacity and independence of oversight and accountability institutions. But we recognize that we too often approach rule of law reforms in these siloed manner. We've seen this a lot of times over the years. And my bureau, INL, has developed an analytical framework to promote a more holistic approach to this foreign assistance efforts. It tackles the foundational challenges, often ignored in favor of more expedient training in areas that emphasize criminal justice reform. And it cannot take root in a vacuum. So we need to engage across the chain. Police, prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, as well as the private sector, civil society, and media, they all have to be integrated and working together. And this framework also considers the political will, particularly the will to tackle corruption, as well as the government's commitment to rule of law and human rights. Only by building these foundations can we achieve the goals we have set forth in the summit. Finally, we're working to exploit a technological advances to combat corruption. To support this goal, we're hosting a global anti-corruption tech sprint. It's going to be a virtual hackathon from June 20th to 24th. And as part of our new anti-corruption solutions, we're going to use this emerging technologies program, and we invite you to join. So international gatherings like this are really useful. So really thankful for WJF for putting this together. We know that we cannot do this alone, and I hope that in your own way, you can join us in this fight. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and thanks again.
Thank you very much, Jim. Ms. Odhiambo, Mr. Walsh has laid out a governmental agenda, but you, the Legal Empowerment Fund, advance bottom-up approaches and promoting investment in grassroots organizations as key to building more just communities. Tell us about your call for investment and how you see supporting legal empowerment as key to achieving systematic change.
Thank you very much, Jan. This is truly an exciting moment for our justice community. Following years of discussion and debate, including and especially here at the World Justice Forum, of the power of people-centered justice, we've arrived at a moment of action. We've identified the need, we've learned about what works, and how we have the opportunity to resource legal empowerment globally and at scale. Grassroots legal empowerment groups are helping communities know, use, and shape the law to build more just and resilient communities and societies. Moreover, these frontline activists are tackling the erosion of rule of law from the bottom up. The impact of their work can be dramatically amplified and expanded, but only if we seize this moment and resource the legal empowerment field and enable those groups to achieve systemic justice. Legal empowerment as a field has been gaining attention over the years, but I was reminded the other day that the concept of legal empowerment has been around for decades. For example, in 1950s apartheid South Africa, you had activists and paralegals working with community members to navigate the repressive rules that were displacing people from their homes and dispossessing them of their land. In the 1970s Philippines, you had paralegals working with communities again who had been accused of violating the then existing martial laws. And in the early 2000s, Vivek Maru, CEO of Namati, helped pioneer a paralegal program in Sierra Leone at a time when they had only about 100 lawyers, and most of them were located in Freetown, the capital city. In these resource-scarce and restrictive regimes, legal empowerment has risen to the top as a key avenue to achieve access to justice. And legal empowerment itself grew out of the tradition of legal aid, and it focuses on communities knowing the law, using the law, and subsequently shaping the law, a bottom-up approach to bringing about systemic change. As we know, globally, the respect for rights is really on the decline, which means something isn't working. We therefore need to invest in legal empowerment because it plays a significant role in addressing systems of power that have marginalized people. And legal empowerment gets to the root cause of injustice by addressing those particular justice systems from a local and a very granular level. We also need to fund legal empowerment because it doesn't just focus on the outcome, but also on the ability of people to engage in the process. Local solutions that are rooted in local values are the most effective path to solving systemic issues. When people engage in the process, they become more invested, more empowered, and they then have the ability to hold government institutions accountable, which in turn catalyzes systemic change. I think we also need to fund legal empowerment because it's really cost-effective and plays an essential role in ensuring inclusive and just systems. Legal empowerment, I have to say, is one of the key avenues of de-siloing the approach to access to justice because it recognizes that really important role that non-lawyers play in the access to justice chain. For most people, access to justice is not about finding a lawyer and going to court. It really is about getting advice and finding practical solutions to a pressing problem that they have. And to do this, most people don't go to courts. They actually end up going to local grassroots activists and community organizers within their midst to find solutions to these problems. I always remember a story that I like to tell. When many moons ago, when I was younger, much younger, I worked for the now former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Kenya. And one of his legacies, he said, was to build courthouses in each county in Kenya, and there are 47 counties in Kenya. So he always said, I have to make sure that we have a courthouse, a high court in each of the 47 counties. And as he embarked on this, he always used to say to me, Atieno, I'm building these courthouses, but I don't think people are going to come. Nobody's going to come, because the reality is, in Kenya, like in most other countries, 90% of the disputes are resolved outside of the courts, outside of the formal court system, and are also resolved using non-lawyers. So it's really key and important to see where legal empowerment comes into this access to justice realm. To your second question, Jan, legal empowerment is key to achieving systemic justice, because it can help equip people, and especially the poor and the marginalized, to use the law to enforce their rights. Once people can enforce their rights, then you have this social accountability process that will seek to monitor public officials and institutions. Legal empowerment also equips people to advocate for and effect changes in laws, rules, and systems, and this improves their ability to enjoy their human rights and to live better lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Atieno. I'm going to turn to Mr. Bertok. The OECD is also putting an increased emphasis on people-centered approaches to access to justice. Tell us about that, and what are the OECD's efforts on the subject?
Thank you so much, Jane. My sincere thanks to the World Justice Project and also co-producing partners for this kind of invitation. It's a great pleasure to reflect with you on our contribution. First, let me start by underlying how crucial the rule of law for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. We are considered as an economic organization, but when our members, the 38 countries, they updated our vision statement last year, they put rule of law at its heart. So the OECD is formally, in its vision statement, forms a like-minded community committed to the preservation of individual liberty, the values of democracy, and the rule of law, and the protection of human rights. So this is really our new, and this is our renewed commitment to preserve the rule of law. Second, you made reference to the context, and particularly in the context of the pandemic or the geopolitical context. And that makes this conversation particularly timely. The World Justice Project, but also other sources, show how many countries they are experiencing declines on their rule of law performance. And the OECD members are not immune to this phenomenon. This decline has become a concern in our membership. They observe the democratic fragility and disconnect between people and public institutions. They are really concerned of the low levels of trust in government, the low levels of trust in public institutions and services, including justice institutions. So in response to these growing concerns, the OECD has launched the Reinforcing Democracy Initiative last year. As part of this initiative, we are delivering new evidence on trust in public institutions, with specific focus on the factors influencing the trust and also the drivers, the levers for building trust. The forthcoming report is based on a game changer survey on the drivers of trust in public institutions. We are also using this new evidence to advance the dialogue. And I'd like to mention that in November, we're going to organize a global forum hosted in Luxembourg and also ministerial meeting of the Public Governance Committee, and with specific focus on trust and democracy, working closely with countries such as the United States, which chairs the Public Governance Committee. Going to the question in specific, as we all know that responsive justice systems and preserving the rule of law are core elements to vibrant and healthy democracies. The OECD is supporting countries in putting people at the center of justice systems. So last year, we published the OECD framework and good practice principles for people-centered justice, which identified a series of critical elements, and I'd like to highlight some of these to form government-wide strategies. Starting with the leadership. leadership that is committed to people-centered culture. This can enable all public institutions and levels of government to guide decisions about justice transformation with people at the forefront of consideration. The second element is mobilizing empirical evidence. And I'd like to highlight this is really essential for designing justice responses based on people's legal and justice needs. So for example, we are working with countries to design their legal needs surveys and also including the most vulnerable groups in these surveys. Providing such data for planning, for policymaking purposes, this is really essential. The third element is empowering people to uphold their own rights. This can take many forms, including fostering legal literacy, but also education. And last but not least, I'd like to highlight that I'm from the Public Governance Directorate, so building, supporting governance arrangements for people-centered justice. This is to understand how these are coherently, consistently, they are all supporting this new approach. So this new approach that calls for sufficient capacity, clear roles, responsibilities, some coordination, but also using, as you mentioned, the technology. Technology, for example, to identify the institutional bottlenecks, but also reshaping the user's perspective. So these are some of the areas and also our commitment. And I'm looking forward to continuing the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Janos. Ms. John, the recommendations we're discussing are being presented against a backdrop of dramatically shrinking space for civil society in many parts of the world. Will the ideas that your co-panelists are putting forward reverse these trends? And from the perspective of a leader of a global civil society network, what do you see as the key recommendations to safeguard civic space and get us back on track to achieve the SDGs?
Thank you, Jen. I'm going to start by saying I feel like I've won the conference lottery because in every session I'm getting to sit beside a woman who's made spectacular contributions to rights and justice. So, Atieno, hats off to your work. And there are many of us here who love and admire everything you do. I want to respond by presenting three facts and something we're all familiar with. One, of course, we've talked a lot about how civic space is constantly under threat. Only 3% of the world's population currently lives in contexts where you can freely, express your civic freedoms, or you can, kind of experience your civic freedoms. So the freedom of expression, the freedom of peaceful assembly, and the freedom of association. So last year, the top two violations in relation to civic space were the detention of protesters and attacks or the intimidation of human rights defenders. And this clearly points to a trend in the way that we invest in and support and strengthen institutions that are meant to defend human rights and to defend the people speaking on behalf of human rights. And I think with due respect to the fact that we have representatives both from the US government and OECD here, I live in South Africa. I know there was a lot of outrage when the South African government failed to vote, or abstained from voting on the Russia-Ukraine crisis. But the fact that you now have European democracies diverting resources to the very institutions that are defending civic freedoms and civic space is a negative vote for democracy as well. And I think we're not challenging that strongly enough. And when we talk about, the failing trust in public institutions, it's simply because of this pattern of behavior where people who are in power, people who have leadership of the organizations and the states who can make a difference are simply not, exhibiting the kind of moral courage we spoke about in the morning, where they can actually put in all of their will and their resources to make that difference. So the entire project of democracy, in a way, is being led and held up solely by individuals who are taking considerable risks to their own lives and livelihoods on the ground without enough action and without enough investment from the institutions, from the states that actually should be able to do that better. So we're in a context now where, for instance, with the budget cuts that have happened in these past weeks, Sweden is now the biggest recipient of its own aid. You have Denmark considering that as well, and Norway, which is the only country that's visibly profiting from the conflict because of their oil reserves, is also considering a budget cut to democratic institutions. So I think there's a real need to really tear apart the rhetoric of supporting democracy and civic space and civil society, and use spaces like this actually to, to really challenge each other and hold each other accountable.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank all of you for your initial interventions and the recommendations and the work that you're doing. I'd like to go a little bit deeper now and really explore the way that we can move forward and particularly overcome the challenges that have been advanced here and that we know about. So, Etienne, let me start with you. So we know that 1.5 billion people globally have unmet justice needs. And so how are you seeing that justice gap revealed in your everyday work? And is closing the gap simply a matter of more funding, or do we have to rethink who funds, how do we fund, and whether there aren't other kinds of support needed by grassroots movements?
Thank you again, Jan. And just to mention something that Lisa has said, where we have the lack of moral courage by governments to step up. The people who are really stepping up are the grassroots activists and actors. And it is this group of brave individuals, frontline human rights defenders, that the Legal Empowerment Fund is really looking to channel resources to. The lack of access to justice is evident in our everyday lives, and to me it became very glaringly clear when the Legal Empowerment Fund put out its first open call for proposals in January of this year. The proposal period was open just for a month, and in February we closed it. And within that period of time, we received applications from organizations in 153 countries seeking a total combined resources of $233 million in core funding. These groups were working on a different array of issues, all of them very urgent. For example, we have some groups working on, in Colombia, working on the border with Venezuelan migrant women, helping them access justice and prevent domestic violence. We have groups, a feminist-led trans group in Montenegro advocating for legal gender recognition. Also community groups in Guatemala who are fighting for restitution of the ancestral lands that have been taken away from them forcefully for the purpose of extraction of minerals. The lack of sustainable funding continues to be one of the key impediments to legal empowerment work. And this, the Legal Empowerment Fund, which is the newest program of the Fund for Global Human Rights, is the only initiative that is solely dedicated to closing this gap. I think one of the things we are looking to do is to make sure that we are able to raise over $100 million in 10 years and disperse this to frontline legal justice organizations who are at the forefront of fighting for human rights. And you're right, Jan, that closing the justice gap is not just about funding. There's a lot more that goes into it. So, for example, just beyond providing funding, the Legal Empowerment Fund is looking at developing community leaders and having these groups come together and do a lot of cross-learning and intersectional learning from each other, because we realize that in every continent and every issue, there are different ways in which we learn from each other and are able to get lessons and translate that into our own communities. We're also looking at bringing groups together through the Legal Empowerment Network, which is a network that is led by NAMATI, convened by NAMATI, and again, bringing about the cross-learning from different segments of the world. I think the one thing about the funding issue that I have to point out is, what is referred to as the colonial gaze and the decision-making process around issues and the importance of resources. I've used this term, which I heard about the other day, and it's really a dynamic through which individuals residing in high-income countries, get to decide what is important, what is known, and how it should be framed. So it really boils down to the question of who decides what is valued. And this is where it is imperative, and a fact that the Legal Empowerment Fund takes very seriously in making sure that we relocate the power of grant making into the hands of the people that it affects the most. And to this extent, we engage in participatory grant making, not just because it's the right thing to do or in line with human rights values, but it's because the people who are closest to the problems are the ones who know how to solve it. Because legal empowerment is about people-centered justice, we have also engaged in the idea of collaborative expertise. As a lawyer and as a legal aid baby, as I like to call myself, I always went into communities and into societies and felt that this is a very interesting issue to attack or to legislate over. And one of the things we never did was really to engage communities. So, for example, in Kenya, where you have a high court order that has said that women who go into public hospital to have their children should not be detained if they're unable to pay the costs. Now, this was a case that was litigated and the judgment came out in 2016, but in 2021 we're still having the same issue. Yet it was a very big victory, was talked about and celebrated all over. But the problem was that the lawyers, we went to court, we got that victory, but at no point did we disseminate that information down to the people who really benefit from it. And this is where legal empowerment comes in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, talking about collaboration, turning to you, Janos, how can the kind of people-centered approach that the OECD is now advancing produce change at scale? And what steps can concretely be taken by different stakeholders to promote this holistic vision of the rule of law?
Thank you so much, Jane. And I fully share the views of the previous speakers. This is time for action. And the OECD Reinforcing Democracy Initiative that previously mentioned is action-oriented. So it includes the scaling up of our current efforts to strengthen the rule of law and promote a people-centered approach to access to justice. So we promote a broad approach to the rule of law from various areas and actors of public governance. This includes fair access to justice, the people they can obtain redress, but also a focus on integrity, transparency, and fairness in regular enforcement. In order to get countries closer to the SDG 16 0-point target, we are focusing our work to deepen our understanding of the people-centered rule of law. So the OECD pays particular attention to the elements I'd like to highlight. It starts with the focus on implementation of the rule of law culture for both the state officials and the society. First, enhancing capacity of governments to strengthen the rule of law by increasing attention to the independence, transparency, accountability, and integrity across all public institutions, building trust between law enforcement authorities and communities. And I fully agree with Lisa that trust is key, and this needs to be preserved. So empowering people through access to their direct experiences to legal information and services, this is the way how to build trust in public institutions. Data is a second element, fostering the use of data. This is a major asset for governments in order to effectively design policies, but also to reflect how the needs of people, they are changing and how to meet these expectations. For example, to help countries with actionable data of the functioning of integrated system, we just launched the OECD Public Integrity Indicators, and this points to the vulnerabilities. This is also tracking progress, enhancing resilience to corruption. And I'd like to echo Lisa's and other points of how civil society organizations and free and independent media are essential to making people-centered rule of law a reality. And we are supporting and working with countries in protecting civic space, freedom of expression, but also fighting mis and disinformation, because these are all together form parts of our holistic mission. Thank you.
Thank you, Janos. Jim, we've been talking about trust, and corruption poses challenges as daunting as the justice gap. And despite decades of effort, this scourge seems only to morph and to grow. And next year, the United States will host the Conference of States Parties to the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. That was adopted 20 years ago. So how do you hope to use that conference and other multilateral fora to turn the tide on corruption globally and increase the trust that everybody feels is lacking?
Thank you, Jan. Yeah, the United States, we're very excited about hosting the Conference of State Parties next year. While we're still formulating the agenda we wish to pursue, we do have some themes. So for the first time, I think I'm going to reveal publicly some of those themes with you all. So we see the COSP as an opportunity for the United States to really reaffirm and even strengthen our cooperation with fellow state parties to tackle some of the toughest corruption-related challenges facing us today, including curbing illicit finance, combating kleptocracy, and promoting effective asset recovery and return. So the United States, we hope to leverage our costs to continue to push state parties to live up to their international anti-corruption obligations, particularly those obligations contained in the UNCAC. As we've heard from all our speakers, we're increasingly seeing countries not follow up on their actions. We need to act. And so we need to see these countries questioning the adequacy of the UNCAC. But we've long argued that they're not gaps or deficiencies. The deficiencies are in the implementation. And so at this point, we think will be a major theme for our COSP and our COSP presidency. I would also note the United States knows the fight against corruption cannot be won by governments alone, which is why another key theme of U.S. presidency will be championing the role of civil society and youth and how they play in our anti-corruption efforts. The fight against corruption belongs to everyone, and as governments, we need to empower our citizens to join this fight. And recognizing the fight against corruption must be a collective one, we're also pleased to partner with Transparency International to host the International Anti-Corruption Conference in DC this December. And it's going to be one of our preeminent global events in the fight against corruption, and we hope to see you all there as well. Ultimately, we're hoping to use many of these forums to advocate for an idea that has been gathering support in recent years. And that's the need to move from commitment to action, as we just mentioned. Rather than governments focusing our attention on making new commitments, we must build on previous commitments we made through the many multilateral fora that have formed the international anti-corruption architecture. For instance, we continue to strengthen compliance with UN Convention Against Corruption obligations, regional standards, or country-level commitments made through processes such as the Open Government Partnership or Summit for Democracy, as I just mentioned earlier. So we should invest in reporting out on progress against these commitments to the public. And it's essential to demonstrate how we are upholding justice. If we make new commitments, they should be built upon previous commitments wherever possible. For example, every international anti-corruption treaty has a review mechanism that identifies exactly where a country can do better in implementing their obligations. And instead of making new commitments, countries can just address the gaps that are identified in these reviews. So finally, I think governments, they must ensure the commitment's implementation is done in close partnership, as I said, with civil society and the private sector. We got to do this all together, and it's a collective effort.
Thank you so much, Jim. And Lisa, collective effort. And we all know that combating corruption is a very important objective. But what concerns do you have about global law enforcement efforts, including those to combat corruption, being co-opted or misused to curtail civic freedoms? And what recommendations do you have to counter such abuses?
Thank you. So I think one or two things. One, there really needs to be a much stronger effort to see how much institutions are willing to open themselves up for scrutiny and to be accountable to what the commitments that they've promised to deliver on. And the fact again that a lot of the peer-to-peer mechanisms or the UN mechanisms for country-level reviews of how guidelines and standards are being implemented are being dismantled quite quickly. So on one hand, we have a lot of talk globally about how much countries want to support the idea and the values of democracy and rights, but at the same time, we're having less investment towards the very mechanisms that could actually uphold those guidelines and standards. So I think there's a huge disconnect there. And the scrutiny has to happen in the local space. I mean, there cannot be a process where governments fly off to somewhere in the global north and then talk about what they're going to do back home if that isn't accompanied by a conversation at home itself. So I know for me, I've worked on civic space and democracy for decades. I've never been invited by my own home country to ever talk to them about how they want to implement standards in their own country. And I think in many countries, the ability to then use dialogues or civil society summits to disconnect from your own population and make commitments in a space where you're completely not opened up for scrutiny or accountability is something we need to constantly challenge. The good thing about not being able to travel during COVID was that leaders couldn't run away, right? Like they couldn't fly off somewhere else and say whatever they wanted to. And that's why you've seen in country after country, people were on the streets protesting because all of the promises that were made in terms of social protection policies, employment, access to essential services, protection from gender-based violence, protection from all kinds of discrimination. There was a much stronger force in terms of saying that your accountability lies with the population that has made you a leader, and you need to be answerable there. So my concern, when I hear about a lot of the global summits that are being proposed on democracy and civic spaces, how much is it really empowering groups on the ground? Because governments are going to love to go all over the world and make all kinds of promises, but unless we're actually investing in the mechanisms and the organizations that ensure that those promises are kept, it's kind of an empty or a bucket with a hole, right? You're just pouring water in and it's flowing out.
Thank you so much. I've now got some questions from the audience, and I'm going to pose them to the whole panel, and then I'm going to give the panelists about 3 minutes each. You can answer any or all of them, and also if you'd like to give us a concluding thought, understanding that we only have a certain amount of time. But let me give you the questions that are in the minds of our audience. So one of them is, how can the donor community scale up its investment in justice reforms to achieve meaningful systemic change at local levels? And how can, the other way around, how can community policy activism and advocacy better align with the multilateral and intergovernmental level decision making? So both ways. Then all of you have mentioned the importance of cross-sectoral collaboration, and the questioners would be interested to hear how this can be put into practice, how we can link. Again, it's another way of asking the same question, so obviously this is of interest to people, how we can connect grassroots initiatives to the more top-down initiatives pursued by governments and international organizations. And an additional question is what are you looking to the private sector to do? And also, people are asking how all of the efforts that you're making in your various areas can be mutually reinforcing. I think the line of questioning is quite clear. I'm going to start with you, Jim. 3 minutes.
Thanks. That's a lot of great questions. I'll try to put them together as best I can. Well, let me start with the private sector. I think, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to have an event in June to really find some innovation. There's so much innovation around the world, and we really, I don't think, done a very good job at applying what the private sector is doing in various efforts to address this issue. And so our hope is to reach out to the private sector and encourage them to come up with some innovative ideas. We can be a lot more transparent as governments, and it can be more cost efficient for us as well if we look at some of those innovations. I think also the engagement is important as well with private sector on how they can address corruption as businesses. I'm really glad OECD is with us because we're going to work with them to hold a business integrity roundtable that's going to bring together private sector and government representatives to address pressing issues as well. The United States, as I mentioned, we have a new strategy, and I think one of the challenges we discussed earlier on is how hard it is to integrate all our efforts. We're very siloed as governments and civil society. And so to me, I think coming together and creating a comprehensive plan, which we did at the US level, has brought us together as an interagency to think about this issue as a national security problem and integrate it to broader issue specs. For example, we talk about transnational crime. Part of my other portfolio is addressing narcotics and illicit drugs. And we've been going after transnational criminal organizations, but we never thought about the corrupt actors that enable them and thrive in this environment. And so integrating all our various strategies is one example of bringing not just this community to be coordinated and working together, but all these other communities that work on these other subsets of issues. And so I think it's a great opportunity to really come together and apply these lessons learned. We've seen what's happened in Afghanistan. We've seen what happened with Arab Spring. We see what's going on in Ukraine. And what is the underlying root cause of all this? And so there's this appetite, I think, with a lot of governments, a lot of citizens around the world to take on this issue. So I also see this as an opportunity, as I think you mentioned earlier, Jan. And so we're really looking forward to these next few years where I know, in the United States can really demonstrate some leadership on this issue.
Thank you so much. Etienne.
Thank you. So I think I'll answer the question on how we can connect grassroots initiatives to the top-down effort. And I think something that has come up in several panels during the forum is the use of data. And I think it was Maya Daruwala yesterday from the India Justice Report who had spoken about the fact that a lot of data is being collected, but not much is collected in the informal justice sector. And without this information and without this data, then how are we going to integrate and how do we know how justice is received and how justice is denied in those communities? I think we've also become very much of what my husband has referred to as data vampires. We go in, we collect data from different small organizations and we leave, but there are no resources that then flow back into these organizations. And I think the data needs to be, first of all, we need to get local and granular, like Maya Daruwala suggested, but also make sure that then the very people whose data is being collected are part and parcel of designing the solution. So for example, even within looking at learning and research agendas, which again, really inform how we are providing justice, but we have to make sure that, that it's not just the extraction of the information, but also the co-creation of the methodologies developed in order to access justice. So I have this, desire and wish that the data that is collected, the data that is used, will actually be beneficial at a grassroots level, not just at a top-down level.
Thank you so much. Janos.
Thank you so much, and I fully agree. And just continuing with the data, this is one of the biggest deficiency, and that's the reason that we are putting particular emphasis and helping countries in designing surveys. I'd like to also highlight that coming from the good governance perspective and in charge of public governance or framework, for the framework for the people-centered justice promotes a whole of government, whole of society approach. The OECD is a platform which not only ensures coherence and consistency coordination within the executive or across government and across levels of government, but this is also we are promoting as a platform the dialogue with the private sector and the civil society. I'd like to highlight that what we learn is as part of this Trust in Government survey, what we are going to launch, the resulting report, that the results, the quality of services, they are very important. but what we learned that how the services are designed and delivered, this is even more important for fostering trust in government. So in that sense, as highlighted in many previous interventions, engagement, not only the users, but engagement of the various strata, the various groups of the society, the private sector definitely, and transparency, providing full information and accountability, so keeping public decision makers, public institutions fully accountable for the results and the process. These are the elements, and this is vital for maintaining trust in government. So I like to just highlight that from a donor community perspective, of course, the OECD, through the Development Assistance Committee, we are coordinating efforts, and we see this huge impact on the geopolitical context. And of course, we are supporting the shifts in order to reflect more recent changes in the world.
Thank you so much. Lisa.
So I'm just going to touch on 2 points that were raised. One was the role of the private sector, and the other was the investment in multilateralism. So on the role of the private sector, Civicus did a study in 2019 on the role of non-state actors in violating civic space. In many contexts in the world right now, threats from non-state actors, particularly from the private sector, are actually larger than threats from government to human rights defenders. And I think we all know, just from the debates on inequality, that there is an obscene concentration of wealth and power in very few groups of the political and economic elite. And I think it's that the challenge to that, that is the biggest investment we need to make in multilateralism, because across borders, we celebrated 75 years of the UN 2 years ago. Next year will be 75 years of the UN or the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. This really has to be a period where all of the energy, all of the action that's being called for in relation to people-centered institutions needs to come to fruition. So we really need those ideas that emerged in terms of having a civil society envoy in the UN, for instance, the idea of a citizens' assembly, a global citizens' assembly where people can actually drive the kind of decisions and resolutions that are being made at international levels, and the fact that you need parliamentarians and policy makers who are elected by people to be much more dominant on the world stage and in terms of the decisions that are being made. And I think in that regard, the SDGs in 2020, we said that this would be the decade of action. It's actually the decade of agitation. And if governments who wake up to that sooner are the ones that are going to be around and going to be wiser, because every single person on the planet with a phone is a potential activist today. There is no way you're going to be able to stop the kind of uprising, the kind of anguish, the desperation, the anger that you're seeing on the streets, the fact that you've had two of the biggest mobilizations in human history, the Black Lives Matter protest, but also the Indian, the farmers' protest, at a time, of the pandemic. It just kind of points to the direction of travel in terms of the ability for people to mobilize and the ability for people to mobilize on very fundamental issues of, of justice and of social, economic, environmental justice. So in a way, this is a time where civil society is facing the most restrictions because of, the laws being introduced, the restrictions being, devised and designed and created. But it's also a time where we're going to be able to push back in a way that we've never been able to before, just simply because of access to information and access to new forms of solidarity.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask each of the panelists one last thought. If you could have one commitment coming out of this forum that you think would help to close the justice gap, what would it be? I'll start with you, Etienne, now.
Mine is very simple. Government has to fund and resource legal empowerment.
Okay. Jim.
I like the idea of getting better data. We need a global architecture for all the governments to collect this information so we know how bad the problem is. And it'll shine a big flashlight on how much money is being stolen that is going to be needed in these austere environments as we deal with a very, very difficult economy going forward.
Thank you. Janos.
As the OECD, we are very much committed to accelerate this move towards people-centered justice and really promoting the people-centered approach to the rule of law. So we are dedicated, for example, our next Justice Roundtable to bring this up, and we are inviting all of you to join in September, hosted by the government of Latvia, in order to share the latest good practices, share the insights from applying tools and the data available. So thank you so much, and looking forward to continuing our partnership.
Thank you. Lisa.
My wish is very simple. We need to make a commitment that the next World Justice Forum takes place in the Global South, and it's hosted by governments in the Global South who are committed to achieving justice.
Well, as we come to the close of this forum, I would really like to thank all the panelists for their very, I think, interesting insights and actually very complimentary insights. I do believe that we can leave here with hope and cautious optimism that we will be able to build more just societies. It's a very ambitious goal, but I do believe that throughout this forum we've seen many ways that we may be able to reimagine justice systems. And I think we've seen a clear commitment from all to understand the diverse ways in which people seek justice and how justice systems can better serve people's needs. And we've heard, not just here in this plenary, but I think throughout many of the sessions during this week, the importance of multi-stakeholder partnerships and integrated approaches, and not just whole of government approaches, although that's important, but really whole of society approaches and a focus on the most vulnerable. We've heard that, I think, in every event during this week, particularly a focus on women and girls, and a focus on harnessing the dynamism and innovation of youth. And I think key to all of this, as we've heard often, is data, but data used well. And I think that's a very important point. Also, sustainable financing. And as somebody said here on this panel, and I find this particularly important, political will. Very important, I think, wherever we sit. So I want to thank all of you for your participation, but particularly for your continuing action on these key issues. And I do think that together we can drive transformative change. So thank you all very much.